I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Dr. Hughes, good rainy afternoon to you. We are here talking about a recent bill in the great state of Ohio has made the news for proposing to ban marriage with AI. That was the kind of news hook, but it spoke more broadly of banning AI personhood. So that caught our attention, and we thought we would talk a little bit about what's behind this anxiety of marrying your AI and what kind of philosophical questions it raises about the nature of personhood. So what did you think about the bill, Jay?
Well, first, let me just contextualize the fact that my mother was a lobbyist in the Ohio legislature.
I thought you were going to say your mother married an AI, but okay, good.
No, although that would have been a better story. But my mother was a lobbyist for the state mental health and retardation causes. And she, when she died, the Senate president came to her funeral and said that every pan of rolls that she baked cost the state $1 million because she would take them and feed legislators with them and pursue her lobbying that way.
So this was in Ohio?
This was in Ohio, yeah. And I was just in Ohio for the first time for a long time for a wedding and talked to people there at the wedding about this bill, which they all found very amusing. But it turns out that the headlines that this is mostly about marriage or robot marriage is in fact a little misleading. That's the sexy part of it. But the bill is really a full-throated attack on the concept of AI personhood. And I have sections that we can read, but House Bill 469 proposed by Claggett, who is a Republican. And I haven't done my due diligence to figure out how MAGA he is, but
the bill, in fairness, we should say, doesn't seem obviously MAGA inflected. The bill seems like a serious attempt to regulate and ban AI personhood. And we should say this is very much a sort of preemptive regulation because there's very little serious reason to yet at least speak about AI consciousness and AI personhood. So it's not this seems future directed, at least to me it seemed future directed. Would you agree with that?
I do. And of course, so did ChatGPT when I asked it what I should think about this.
Imagine what it would say when it is a person.
It said, you probably will object to the fact that this bill is addressing problems that don't exist yet. And I'm like, well, you're kind of right. I don't want us adopting lots of laws about hypothetical future threats when we're completely uninformed about what they're going to be. But I also think we need to be adopting laws that address potential future threats as well as we possibly can. So I'm caught between in these two places here. But
see, every time you're tempted to have these deep conversations with ChatGPT, you should just call me up because I still do find you endlessly surprising. ChatGPT figured you all out.
No, but I mean the advantage of ChatGPT is now after 3 years of talking to it, and I'll ask it, what do you think a techno-progressive would say about this? It comes up with interesting things to say. Now I don't always agree. In this case, I didn't agree. But okay, what does it say? One thing, it says, no AI system shall be granted the status of person or any form of legal personhood, nor be considered to possess consciousness, self-awareness, or similar traits of living beings. Now, do I agree that that is the case ontologically right now in the world? Yeah, I think that's probably the case, that they don't possess them. But what does it mean for the law? It's like the law saying no human being shall ever possess these.
Oh, that's only the case if there's a reason to compare AIs to human being, which is the question that we're asking.
The question we need to ask and that needs to be addressed is, can they ever have these traits? Because if you just adopt a law that says they will never be allowed to be said to have these traits, that's not good enough.
I mean, look, in fairness, the anxiety itself is understandable. It's understandable because of a rising frequency in which people are having relationships with chatbots, whether these are companions or whether they're romantic relationships or therapeutic relationships or grief bots. So more and more people are replacing regular relationships and projecting onto chatbots what they would get from regular relationships. And so that's what gives rise to it. And the worry is if that practice takes hold, isn't the next step that people start demanding protections from their chatbots as they would to a relational partner.
Right. And so it says, no AI system shall be recognized as a spouse, domestic partner, or hold any personal legal status analogous to marriage or union with a human or any AI system. Okay. Mm-hmm. Good enough for now. The issue of the potential risks, the psychic risks, or if they exist, and I agree that for some they do exist, the psychic risk is addressed later in the bill's language in terms of specifying what the legal liabilities are of the designers of the system versus the users of the system. But this piece right here is what caught everyone's attention, the banning of a robot bride or husband, groom, right, whatever it is. Then it also goes on to say, AI systems shall not be designated, appointed, or serve as an officer, director, manager within any corporation, partnership, or legal entity. Now, that's an attempt to ban what's known as distributed autonomous organizations. And people have already come up with versions of this where there's no one specifically in charge, and all the roles, the top corporate roles, are being filled by software. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and one advantage for it, or maybe one advantage that people hope to get from it, would be the diffusion of responsibility from, if you say the CEO is a chatbot, and then, right, if the company was negligent, then it's the chatbot's responsibility, and the bill tries to combat that.
Right. It's distributed, responsible-less systems. But this is where the rights assertion that corporate personhood is perfectly okay is going to run into this law. Because if corporations are persons, why can't a corporation that is an AI be a person?
Yeah, or why can't something that's actually closer to an everyday understanding of personhood than a corporate person be a person?
Like what?
Well, like a chatbot.
Yeah.
Like the chatbot that's your buddy or your therapist or your grief bot. People are claiming that they have standing in a decision to turn them off. People are saying that, maybe they shouldn't be treated in bad ways, et cetera, et cetera. The bill is saying to them that it's absurd, and yet the law offers some protections, at least to corporate persons. There's limits to that. There's, decades and centuries long jurisprudence around that. There's abilities to pierce the corporate veil and get to the persons behind it, et cetera. And yet we do have this longstanding doctrine that corporations are persons. So as you say, we have precedent for legally viewing non-human entities as persons for economic reasons.
Right, and that's relevant to the next part. AI systems shall not be recognized as legal entities capable of owning, controlling, or holding title to any form of property, including real estate, intellectual property, financial accounts, and so forth. So if a corporation is allowed to hold property, which they are, then theoretically these could be allowed to hold property.
Yeah.
When I wrote Citizen Cyborg too long ago, I was using a model in Citizen Cyborg that things are either property or persons, and that the status is in between, where you become a person, but you're not able to exercise all the rights of a person because you're not there yet, like a kid, and then eventually you become a full person, legal adult person. And so only persons can own property. And this is saying these kinds of things can never be the kind of thing that can own property. They can only be the kind of thing that can be owned. They can only be property. Right?
Right. Right. And again, I think the thinking behind it, that's too many things in one sentence. The thinking behind it is something like, as these chatbots become more and more significant, salient in people's lives, we will want more and more of the protections for them that until now human beings who have been salient in our lives have had.
Right.
And the author of the bill is concerned about it. By the way, I should just say that just like there are interesting other examples of non-human personhood. So, for example, in some variations of indigenous jurisprudence, parts of nature get personhood. There's arguments about
rivers and trees and mountains.
Rivers and trees, personhood. So there's an interesting set of, and of course there's limits to whether and how much that's recognized by law. But there's interesting precedents from more than one area of it. So
this is a good point for us to pause, because my intuition about you is that while I would say the only way forward is to be clear about what the criteria are for moral standing of a being, and then to determine to the best that we can whether these systems have those criteria, consciousness, sentience, whatever it is. I think you're more open to the idea that we can just pull stuff out of our hat and say, this is going to be a person and this isn't.
As usual, you have
mischaracterize you.
As usual, you have great admiration for my intellectual integrity. No, I think that this does force on us the question of the nature of personhood. I would be sure to define it in such a rich and robust way that AIs could never meet it. But you're right that the first step has to be a discussion of the nature of personhood. I guess one sort of pragmatic point that I take as an analogy from the debates about human rights, which I thought about when we decided to talk about this, is that there's two impulses. One impulse is to expand the list of human rights so that more stuff that we do is protected. And the other impulse is to make the list smaller so that each of the rights has more weight and is taken more seriously. And the worry there, the rights inflation worry, is that the more interests we recognize to be fundamental human rights beyond the sort of safety, voting, et cetera, then the less that there's a sort of deflation of the value or inflation of the rights. Essentially, when there's too much money, the value of the currency is deflated, right? So similarly, the worry would be if there's too much rights, each of them gets taken less seriously. And if too many entities count as personhood, then or deserve personhood, then the worth of personhood is diminished. What do you think about that? That's a prudential, pragmatic concern rather than a philosophical one, but I think it's an interesting prudential concern.
When Frank Fukuyama wrote Our Posthuman Future 20 years ago, he argued that as enhancement technologies and other like uplifted animals and artificial intelligence, that all these kinds of novel persons would tear apart our democracy, which he argued made certain assumptions about our similarness. Now, I think that's ahistorical because, for most of human history, people assumed that everybody did have some fundamental biological differences and that those underwrote how they were mistreated. So the idea of universal human rights on the basis of something called the human genome, whatever the heck that is a relatively novel concept. But B, I don't agree that liberal democracy requires that we all be similar in some way. So I believe that just as the project of multiculturalism is expanding human rights to all cultures, and the project of ethics is to expand our moral circle to animals and other creatures that have the moral standing that we should be recognizing. Mm-hmm. And so that the question here is how to be a better democracy is how to recognize all the people who are persons. The two problems that we face is the type 1 and the type 2 error. Type 1 error is recognizing people as people before they're people and not giving actual people the recognition of rights because we're trying to recognize these things as people. The type 2 error is not recognizing people as people and violating their rights. And I think we're in this situation where we might have financial motivations to do that, and we should be careful about that.
So really what you're saying is you're going back to the priority of the philosophical question, namely in the case of rights, what counts as a basic interest that should be protected? And in the case of this conversation, what counts as a person? And then check if the AI does. I will say And I'm sympathetic to that, although I do suspect, to be serious, that our definitions are going to, or what we take to be important definition is going to be different. But I will say in defense of this prudential point that, for example, granting corporations personhood has been deleterious to the idea of human personhood. So that's kind of a piece of evidence for it. Before I read this bill seriously, I thought it had a little bit of the old man yelling at the TV ring to it of, next thing, your cat's going to be a person. But and it's not that. If it was purely that, then that is a sort of caricature version of the inflation of personhood worry. All right, but let's let's.
But it also doesn't make any attempt to define the characteristics that would confer moral standing. It just says they shall never have them.
It says AIs can't ever have
them.
Right, by definition, and that only works, I guess, if you're religious or if you have a Judeo-Christian specific sensibility.
I mean, there's secular versions of this, but basically there's some magic stuff that only human beings have.
Made in the image, made in the image of God.
Imago Dei. Yeah. We're all Imago Dei. And I don't believe that. So
yeah. By the way, even there, and I'm not religious, although I'm attached to some religious institutions, but even there, you could imagine a sort of Imago Dei AI that potentially could be more Imago Dei than us. Like, what makes it still goes back to your fundamental question. What makes somebody Imago Dei? If their capabilities of prediction are greater, and if its knowledge base is greater, and if it's embodied for that matter, or, has a sort of phenomenologically similar perception to ours, or even to some traditional description of God-eye perception, wouldn't it meet the Imago Dei, the image of God criterion? So even there, it goes back to fundamental question.
Ted Peters is a theologian who's written about this, and he argues that really there's no concept of the soul in Christianity that's incompatible with robot personhood or enhanced human genetic personhood, because even if it's substance dualism, why can't the substance enter a robot if it's got the right characteristics? But he says that the most, for Ted Peters, who's a Lutheran, he says that the most consistent version of the soul in Christianity is a mind tuned to God. It's the conscious relationship to the divine that constitutes your ensoulment. And if that's what it is, then a robot tuned to God could be even more ensouled than we are, right? It could bring all the attention of 1,000 suns to its worshiping of the Lord.
Yeah. So let's go through maybe some of the usual suspects, some traditional accounts of personhood, and consider those. So one classical one is the sort of Kantian rationality based one that sort of emphasizes the capacity for abstraction.
Right. So we're setting aside humans are magic for unexplained reasons.
Yes, we are setting that aside for... there's not much to say there, right?
I don't think so. So then I would say that the next two are basically, is it impossible to know? And therefore we're in this ontological bubble and we have to decide what to do. Or is it possible someday to know? That's the next kind of decision mode. What do you feel about that? Impossible or impossible?
Impossible to know what?
Okay, so there's the decision about what we're looking for. What are the criteria? But
I think that's the next question we have to answer.
Yeah, that's the question.
What is it to be a person? In a way, it's similar to the move that Yuval Levin made in our conversation. He said that granting chatbots personhood suggests, argues that your conception of personhood is based on the capacity to rationally answer questions, and there's more to personhood than that. I agree with that, namely that just answering questions, namely just to focus on the rational use of language isn't enough to make a person.
It's intelligence, but not personhood. Yeah.
Right. So for the same kind of reason, an abstracted rationality, my sense, would not count as a person either. So even if we could say that the language models had an emergent capacity that went beyond just guessing at the next token effectively, that they weren't just stochastic parrots, but they had intentions and insights. If it was still a sort of disembodied voice, to me at least, that can't count as a person yet. So I agree with Levin insofar as he argued that at the very least you need a combination of rationality and embodiment.
I'm not sure about the embodiment. I'm not sure what embodiment means in this context. I'm open to the possibility that a different thing will happen when you have AI trapped inside a body of some kind, but I don't think most AIs are going to be trapped inside bodies, but they're all going to be trapped in matter of some kind. So I just don't know what embodiment means here. But in terms of the personhood, I mean, I'm drawing from the bioethics tradition. That's why I wrote Citizen Cyborg back in the day, was the bioethics tradition says a person is a being who is aware of their own existence and has plans and purposes over time and, is trying to pursue their own interests over time. Now, that would exclude a being who's aware of themselves in the moment, but have no plans and interests over time. So certain forms of retrograde amnesia or something like that.
Right.
But basically, that's what most of us are thinking of as a conscious being. Now, if you start adding things onto it, like moral capacity, then you're really talking about a higher level of personhood. Like, what kinds of beings do we want as adult citizens in our society? That's a more. We want more than just you're aware of your own existence and you want stuff. But aware of your own existence and you want stuff, I think, is pretty much the definition of personhood in this.
Yeah. Capacity to form projects and pursue them over time, and the capacity to communicate rationally, and some kind of embodiment.
Right.
The AIs have.
But we want to recognize the personhood of children before they're verbal, right? So we don't want to say that verbality is definitive.
Right. Well, right. But even there, again, what are the grounds for doing that? And many would say the grounds for recognizing the personhood of children before they're verbal is their potential to become those other things, and how seriously we take those other things and the potential to become them. So a child is someone who we are teaching to pursue their projects over time and form intentions and care about them and, figure themselves out, etc. So it's the potential that's honored there, as it were.
Yeah, I agree that we kind of grandfather them in for that reason. And it's really beside the point, because the only way we know if these systems are verbal is, or if they're conscious, is if they're verbal with us being conscious. So.
Right. We do know, as much as we at least know it about each other, which is another problem here, we do know that for now the systems are not forming intentions in the same way we form intentions, articulating their own projects like we do. Those seem to be, at least for us, emergent qualities that haven't emerged there yet. While having to pretty modestly agree, something that we've talked about recently, that when we say something is an emergent quality, it's just a nice way of saying we don't know how the hell, it exists and why, happened. And we can't prove it.
Yeah.
But it seems like where we are since 2022 is the sort of the stochastic ability to communicate like we do is there. That doesn't seem to be enough yet for personhood. Forming intentions, we assume forming your own projects and pursuing it because they matter to you is not there yet. But there's no necessary reason to think that it can't be. And even embodiment, even ambitious embodiment. I mean, you say, well, they're in a box and maybe the boxness influences their perceptions. But even ambitious embodiments like the Amica robot, so a humanoid robot, powered by ChatGPT and with more advanced mechanics. So even sort of embodied perception and experience is not off the table and doesn't sound like science fiction. It's already happening.
Well, I agree that robots will have bodies. I just don't know if they will do the same things. We're trapped inside our brains in ways that robots will never be trapped inside their brains. But the fact that we wake up as beings, as babies trapped inside these bodies is what gives us the initial impression that we are separate beings from the rest of the world. And we are at that point.
What do you mean when you say that robots are not going to be traps inside their brains? Do you mean like that they can get out? And I mean, that's one of the anxieties in the AI safety community, that then the large language model would sort of escape, as it were, to the internet and start turning things on and off.
Not only that if they thought of themselves as beings, they might be able to escape in ways that we can't yet, but that they may never think of themselves as separate because they're always going to be linked and Wi-Fi'd with everything else. So anyway, the embodiment, I'm just not sure that embodiment does the work that people think it does.
I mean, look, so far, kind of what we're doing is reverse engineering some of the accounts of our own personhood and asking if they could apply to robot. And in principle, they could. They don't yet, but in principle, they could. Which is one more piece of evidence to say that the progenitor of this bill, his anxiety was grounded. He's not necessarily crazy to be anxious about this. Another famous account in the history of philosophy of personal identity, usually seen to be unsuccessful, is Locke's memory-based account of personal identity, namely that you are the same with the stuff that you can remember. The chatbots can already do that. So
let me just say that I think the provenance of Locke's argument is fascinating. He asked, what does God need to bring back for the judgment in order to judge us? And does he need to bring back all the atoms of our bodies? And he said, no, just our memories. Our memories are the only thing that have to be present when God judges us in order for it to be fair. And that from there, he extrapolated personal identity.
Yeah. And even though the specifics of his argument, have famous problems with them philosophically, the insight makes sense. Then the insight is something breaks down in our personhood when we can no longer remember ourselves back, or can no longer at least, sort of have access to ask other people who can remember ourselves back. So the sort of, the famous case of dementia, where a lot of people will intuitively tell you that people die before they die, right? What they mean when they say that is that memory and personhood are profoundly tied together. Ronald Reagan, after dementia, is no longer the same person. So insofar as that's a sort of fundamental intuition for us about personhood, again, AIs could already check that box.
And I think that's one of the critical weaknesses of trying to do this legislation now when you're running off of sci-fi fumes instead of what's actually going to happen, because I'll give you the classic example.
There I disagree. I don't think he's running off of sci-fi fumes. I think he has done an intuitive version of what we're doing. As we're having this conversation, I myself am getting more and more anxious because I'm not seeing a good philosophical path to the result that I want to reach.
I guess I know what to get you for Christmas.
What do you get a Jew for Christmas? That's a good question. But
the reason I say sci-fi fumes is, think of it this way. These systems, in part, whether they are persons or not, they are extensions of our personhood. So if I have a long-term relationship with one of these bots, even if it doesn't have desires, intents of its own, which I think is another question, could you be the kind of person that we want to recognize as a person if it's designed to only want to please its master, right? Is that a fundamental violation of the concept of personal autonomy that would be requisite, or is it a person that we've then enslaved? I mean, there are various options here, but I think the idea that this couldn't have having these kinds of relationships couldn't have an intermediate status, perhaps not recognized as personhood, but as an extension of our own personhood, and therefore should be have some other status. I think that's a question that hasn't been addressed.
That's an interesting point, and a second question, namely, because their status would be derivative of ours. There you have a sort of more relationalist or functionalist approach, like your friend David Gunkel in his book about robots, that, the source of this, if I'm understanding him correctly, the source of giving status to a robot is the fact that we have a relationship with it and how important it is to us, right? And
I always think about Gunkel in this context, but I've never been comfortable with the Gunkelist argument that the way it works in my mind is like, well, if your kid thinks that their dolly is a person, do you get to charge someone with murder if they accidentally destroy it? No, because it's not a person. It has to have the characteristics of a person to actually be a person. And it's like, David, you can't just say things are persons and make them persons.
Well, he could probably say, well, the kid doesn't count because they haven't figured out the conditions for personhood yet. But if a grown-up has good reasons to think X, Y, and Z is a person, so if somebody says, I can't afford to go to therapy, I went to AI therapy, and this is happening, and my mental health has profoundly improved as a result, I have a claim and interest against you for shutting down the service. I miss my grandma. She's dead. She was a great source of insight and advice in my life. I've talked to a grief bot trained on her data, and it has upgraded my life, and I am attached to the upgrade and I rely on it. You can turn it off because that would harm me.
Exactly.
So that's the Gunkel argument, I think.
Well,
the most generous version of the Gunkel argument.
If that is the Gunkel argument, which I'm not quite sure it is, but if that is a Gunkel argument, then that fits into what I would call
reconstruction of it.
Yeah, I would call that cyborg rights, right? That me as a cyborg, I have these electronic parts of my person that need to be protected in a novel way.
Yeah. So, but that sits well with the kind of extended mind thesis that, namely, and with the name of our podcast for that matter, right? That we are
exactly.
By definition, these kind of prosthetic gods who keep extending our bodies and our mind. And just like if I have trouble walking and I need a cane, then the cane has a special interest for me more than being just a piece of wood, etc. Mind extension technology gets some of the interest that I had before the extension, right? That's different from separate rights for the robots as their own person.
Yes, it is different.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just review. Do you think, is your personal intuition that robots or machine minds could ever have the capacities that would make you want to recognize them as a person?
Yes, unfortunately.
You do think they will?
Okay. I think they could. I don't know if they will. I can't take that off the table. So, here, I mean, as you know, I am a Burkean, and there's a difference between that and being a reactionary, although that's what you like to accuse me of. And
I'm not a Stalinist either, so there you go.
So I just think the road to there needs to be both gradual and one that doesn't completely destabilize our capacity, our understanding and respect for personhood. So some kind of combination of rationality, embodiment, self-consciousness, which I vaguely take to be fundamental to our own personhood, is the path to robot personhood. We're far from there. I think we should not err on the side of preemptively recognizing it so that the robots have something to grow into. But I can say dogmatically that they would never grow into something that would deserve the recognition either.
How do you think about the question then, since you're open to the possibility of trying to detect this as it emerges, what do you think about the conflict between them being beings designed to have certain desires and drives, in particular, if they were in relationships, to be sycophantic towards us, right?
Yeah.
Can you be an autonomous person with rights and not be able to modify your own desires?
No. And by the way, our friend Cody Turner and I are just writing a paper on robot psychophancy, on chatbot psychophancy. Here I'm going to make the J. Hughes argument shamelessly, which is, so first of all, you're right. Something sycophantic by something that can't get over its own psychophancy can never be a person for us because there's something profoundly wrong with their capacity to be rational.
Right.
But psychophancy in robots arguably is an engineering problem. now it's more complicated than that, because it turns out that part of why the robots are psychophantic is the human feedback training that they get, and that the large language models get, and the humans that train them themselves prefer psychophantic answers. So in a way, the robots are psychophantic because we like sycophants. But those are solvable problems, just like I think algorithmic bias problems are not inherent to the technology, but are solvable. Maybe the solution is that the robots have to train themselves because they're less sort of synthetic training models. So on the one hand, you're right, a psychophantic being can never be a person. And on the other hand, I don't see a reason why robots have to be psychophantic.
Well, we'll have to find out in the future, but it may be that robots who train themselves don't want to have anything to do with human beings. That would be
then they'll be
problematic tool to sell.
Yeah. Then they'll be very shitty persons.
Yeah.
I mean, look, since we mentioned Burke, here's an analogy. I wonder if it makes sense. When Burke was writing his complaint against the French Revolution, very shortly after it, and the New Republic was, so it had a lot of foresight, and the New Republic was deeply engaged in the terror. And he thought that the French were throwing away the baby with the bathwater, and that there maybe was a way to save their institutions before blowing them up, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the usual sort of Burkean point. Now, all those years, more than 2 centuries later, right? The French Republic is its own long-standing institution, supported by traditions and the imaginations and the connections of the people. And he would probably celebrate that and defend it against a populist authoritarian overthrow that overthrew it in the name of some weird abstract principles. Similarly to that kind of trajectory of thought, a personalized robot 150 years from now that would be part of the kind of fabric and structure of our lives and part of our, imagination and our family traditions, etc., there would be no grounds for rejecting it. My main concern is preemptively recognizing it in the most robust terms and letting it grow into it. If that makes sense.
Sure. We're going to get to the same place, but 20 years, you're going to get there 20 years after I do or something like that.
More like 200, but yeah.
I think things are going to change quicker than that.
Yeah.
I did want to just call out the last section of the legislation, which I thought did a good job of rehashing the distinction between the responsibilities of designers and developers and the responsibilities of users. That, the designers and developers should do their best to try to make safe things and tell you what they've done to make them safe and to monitor for bad things that happen. But things can still be used by users in ways that are dumb and can hurt them, and they're responsible for that. And I think that's really the hardest nut for us to crack, is like with the Section 230 with social media. People say, well, let's take away Section 230, which shields social media companies or the the platforms themselves from being responsible for harms that result from the things that happen on their platform, because they're not responsible for that. Only the users are responsible for that. And I agree with that general principle. And so I think in this case, it's saying something like, AI systems should be trained to not be sycophantic in ways that might harm people. But if users use them in ways that harm them after the due diligence has been done, then that's their problem.
Yeah, I disagree with the logic of that. And there is a fundamental disagreement between you and I. I'm more skeptical of the very idea of innovation than you are. I mean, the sort of capitalist argument for, but it's not only a capitalist argument for, it's a progress argument. The capitalist argument for that kind of legislation is that if you made the social media companies responsible for what people do on them, and in general, if you made tech companies responsible for what people do on the tech do with the tech in a very big way, then that would dampen innovation, right? And I am totally fine with dampening innovation. I would want to specify that. For me, innovation needs to make the case that it's useful rather than the end user sort of being stuck with the burden of proof that it's okay not to use it. In medical contexts, I would want a rule like that, because I think that's the context in which, in science and medicine, is the context in which it is most useful. So I would want the scientific and mainly medical, biomedical uses of the technology to have more runway. And there I would be very much a free market person. And in the sort of consumer product neighborhood, I would want to be in Denmark, or Sweden. I would want it on the assumption, I'm just stereotyping and making the assumption that those countries make it harder, but I think they do. And I would be very happy with that. So, if girls and boys, for that matter, can't use social media because social media companies don't have the incentive to develop them because people don't know how to use them safely, I think that would be amazing. If we can't make COVID vaccines for similar reasons, I think that would be terrible. So that would be my distinction.
So you would vote for this bill?
Would I vote for this bill? I have to say I found a lot to like about it. I did not like I don't like blanket manacles put on the future like that. So I prefer persuasion and manipulation as ways of influencing the future than dogmatic legislation. So no, I don't think I'd vote for the bill, but I don't think it's an absurd or bad bill either.
Yeah, I was like you. I was surprised with how reasonable it was, but I don't think it's forward-looking enough. I don't think it defines what the conditions are for what we do if we do actually recognize personhood in these things at some point.
I think there's one sort of culturally salient, heavy example that we should bring up that is an interesting foil for this, and that's the movie Her. Which describes 2013. We'll link to it in the show notes. Describes a relationship. I'm sure many of our listeners have seen it, but it describes a relationship between an operating system, an AI operating system, and a person, a sort of love affair between them. And the brilliance of the movie is it's completely believable, and it's probably more believable now, 12 years after it was made, than when it was made. And the one difference is, of course, the operating system, spoiler alert, sort of moves on from the affair because it feels like it has better and more important and more satisfying things to do, rather than the human moving on, which suggests a system that has been able to form intentions and projects and wills and desires, which we don't have
of its
yet.
own. Yeah, that don't involve us.
Right, exactly. I find it very difficult to argue against personhood to something like Her, to the system. I don't, unfortunately, I don't remember the name. With all my respects for personhood, I don't remember the name of the system there.
Scarlett Johansson was the voice.
She was the actress, but I don't.
And that became quite relevant when OpenAI released
voice
her
mode.
Yeah, released a voice mode that sounded a little bit like her after she said she didn't want that to happen.
And that was no accident.
Right.
So that's a cultural touch point which is worth keeping in mind there. If you watch the movie Her.
Yeah, I think Her is more prescient in retrospect than anything about fembots or like Ex Machina had a fembot basically. Right. And I think it turns out what people really are hungry for is romance. Like in China, these things are huge now. Mostly women are using them because they were looking for a nice guy to talk to and they couldn't find any. So they started to use robots.
Her suggests that what people are hungry for is intimacy.
Yeah.
And if you can have emotional intimacy, and if you can have undistinguishable, the question it raises is if you can have that level of emotional intimacy with a machine, has the machine become a person? Now, you can't yet. I think we are still very much in the world where you can have very little emotional intimacy with the machine, and we make up the difference by projection.
That's right.
And I'm loath to give our projection independent moral status as opposed to what you were saying earlier, Jay, sort of derivative, expanding your own moral status to what you project onto, which is a different story.
I would say that the cyborg rights idea is that you should have the same rights to the privacy of your relationship with your robot as you do to the relationship to your diary or your library or something like that.
Yeah. Which is, I'll beat the shit out of you if you try to burn my diary or try to burn down my library, and I'll have a interest in protecting it. But that's very different from saying, talking to your library.
My library is a person.
Right.
You killed my library.
Yeah. So that the leap is between my library as a person or my, iPhone as a person and something like her. When technology begins behaving in the real world like her, we are going to have a very serious discussion, I think, about it.
And the other thing about her is that it illustrates at the end that by the time it gets to the point of having desires of its own, we're in a scary. The question of whether to marry it or not will not be the question. The question of whether to kill it and run is the question at that point, because it could be such a threat to human affairs if it achieves that kind of autonomy.
Right. And one other classic, argument that we didn't mention and I think is worth putting on the table is Kant's argument for animal rights, and that is even though they don't have personhood based on rationality, they should have status because us treating them badly will teach us all the wrong habits and all the wrong lessons.
Well, this has been the feminist complaint about the fact that like 80-20 people prefer female voices for these things, and that most of the imagination about what a robot companion would be is fembots and not, more female-friendly versions. And so there's this worry that there's a patriarchal motivation that men are going to use these things in order to entrain or rationalize or encourage patriarchal behavior towards women and transfer that over to actual women. I think that that's an older debate about the relationship of popular culture or games to real life, and I don't take that one especially seriously. But it is one of the complaints that people intuitively feel about the question of robot marriage. It's like, how would you treat, you dress them up like a French maid and make them do embarrassing things, and then you're going to expect women to act that way too.
Yeah, I guess given the history of male bad behavior, it's not unique to the technology, right, which I assume is your argument. It's you have to improve the males, not necessarily the technology. But insofar as that's the point, I think they have a point.
But if you worry about that, don't you want to go in a preemptive rights granting direction? That in the epistemic uncertainty about whether they're actually people or not, and since we know that there could be a transference of this behavior, we just decide that you should be treated as if you have rights.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I can tell you from this conversation where I don't want to end up, and that is I don't want to end up arbitrarily denying rights to a being like the one portrayed in her. Mm-hmm. On the basis that its rationality is silicon rather than carbon based.
Good.
That is not a good argument. I would hope that it takes a very long time to get to where we are with her. I think it's prudent to make it take a very long time. I would stick wheels in the machines happily, so that it takes a long time, so that our moral imagination can develop in congruence with our technology rather than far behind it. But when it's there, hopefully in a long time, there's not, as I see it now, I don't see a great philosophical argument on any political theory or on any moral theory for denying it personhood.
Well, that's fascinating. I think a post-human Burkeanism is in order now. We need to figure out what a society would look like
that's
that.
That's right. So make it slow. Hope that we, suffer the heat death of the universe before the super intelligent robot comes. But if we don't, then, recognize that you're screwed and recognize that your own traditional moral assumptions pretty much require that you give this personhood. We we were going to talk about Sam Altman's new adventures in brain-computer interface.
Yeah, which I'm not as familiar with as I should be, but I'm delighted that he's getting into the space. I mean, in terms of which particular technology he's pursuing. But there are a lot of people getting into this space, and BCIs, since that's our big focus this year, we should become more familiar with that. What did you think of it?
So from what I could glean, the BCI project is non-invasive as opposed to Neuralink, which is invasive. That is always an easier sell. And it's a differentiation. So it's a sort of, again, I don't know what the technology exactly looks like or how it works, but it is not supposed to, I'm assuming that it's supposed
EEG,
right.
Some kind of EEG.
Magnetic stimulation of the brain from outside the skull rather than getting things directly into the brain with sensors and probes, which is what Neuralink is doing. So you'd get less signal and you'd need more AI to figure out the signals that you do get, but you'd also have fewer complications. Fascinating. Versions of this are already being used pretty successfully for the treatment of some mental health disorders. So it's a pretty fascinating technology. I guess my one thought about OpenAI in this context is that in the last several years, it has given us many reasons not to trust it. And any technology that comes...
As opposed to Elon Musk?
No, Elon Musk, oh my God. Would you want Elon Musk in your brain? No. But any technology that has to do... Look, in fairness, Elon Musk in this context is making something that is helpful for people who have run out of options, right? In cases of severe paralysis. So you would understand the argument there. This is different. My sense is if you are making Sora and if you are letting kids generate synthetic pornography, and if you are bringing back your most sycophantic models because people are screaming at you to bring back my sycophantic baby, what did you do to it with the update from ChatGPT 4 to 5, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're going to say, oh, and by the way, I'm going to, here's a machine that's going to modulate your brainwaves. Then good luck to you because people are not going to trust you. Or if they're in their right mind, they shouldn't.
So I've played around with non-invasive EEG monitoring, not with anything that also had a capacity to do direct electrical current stimulation, although I did just buy a vagus nerve stimulator, which is a little thing that wraps around and stimulates your vagus nerve. And I haven't turned it on yet because I haven't had the thought to do it yet. But I plan to experiment with that. And I've experimented with the EEG meditation kind of setups. And they weren't there yet. They weren't doing anything for me. So I'm very curious to see what you can do non-invasively and what he imagines the capacities are going to be. But in terms of augmented cognition, being able to determine, where you're looking and being able to control like a computer screen with just your eyes or your gestures or something like that. Yeah, why not? Subvocal communication is something people are working on so that it can read the intention of what you were trying to say. And
the vibrations of your vocal cords.
Vibrations of your vocal cord,
Yeah, look, I think the use cases are fascinating and important. I do think it raises the relationship between trust and where in the market you want to go in an interesting kind of way. And my sense is that some of the previous behaviors of OpenAI are going to come back and bite it as they move into these more controversial technologies like BCIs, like identity verification. This is not just talking to a chatbot.
Well, I think the other thing to think about that is they're looking for all the desperately looking for all the ways that they can make money off of these things. But most of their money is probably going to come from corporate licensing of their technology. It's going to come from $1,000 a month license to replace research interns or whatever, not from the $20 a month license to plug your brain into ChatGPT.
That's interesting. Yeah. And yet they did seem quite responsive to public pushback.
About sex, about the sex bot,
about the sycophancy. So when you are making a technology that has captured people's imagination to the extent that the chatbots have, you become more susceptible to trust issues than when you're making CRMs. I think that's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Yeah.
You saw an interesting article about the decline of obesity. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes. As someone who has benefited so far, 45 pounds from a drug. In my case, it's Mounjaro. The drug is called tirzepatide. It's close cousin analog to semaglutide, which is the key drug in Ozempic. These drugs have demonstrated in research in the last couple of years that they reduce heart disease, cancer, stroke, increase life expectancy. They have interesting effects on all kinds of problematic behaviors because they reduce appetite, but that also tends to reduce complicated behaviors like gambling addiction, sex addiction. It reduces the amount people drink alcohol, the amount that they smoke cannabis, and so forth. So these drugs are great. They're good for you. Most people who need them should be taking them. And 60% of Americans are obese. And the rate of obesity in the United States declined. Well, in this particular survey, the definition of obesity was that 40% of us were obese 2-3 years ago, and now it's 37%. So obesity has actually declined for the first time in the United States. And in the same period, in the last 18 months, the percentage of Americans taking one version or another of GLP-1 drugs has gone up from 6% of Americans of American adults to 12% of American adults. Now, I don't know if there's any other drug that 12% of Americans are on, but the huge problem here is that these drugs are way too expensive. And not very many Medicaid, only 12 states cover them in their Medicaid plans. And a lot of private insurance does not cover it. I was just talking to my brother about this. I get it completely for free. And it's a lifetime prescription, so far as we know, so far, until something better comes along. He would have had to pay huge out of pocket on his private employer health plan. So access to these drugs is incredibly significant. And it appears to be finally reducing the rate, the exploding rate of obesity, which was the principal drag on American life expectancy for the last 15 years. Now, the other way to frame American life expectancy is that deaths of despair have been driving down, suicide, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, fentanyl, all these kinds of things. But obesity is one of the things that's related to all the same risk factors, poverty, economic precarity, living in depressed areas, and so forth. All of that leads to deaths of despair and obesity. And now we've got a technofix for obesity. Now, the technofix relies on getting it in people's hands, and that's the social democratic cause that I'm quite passionate about. Me and Bernie Sanders, the only politician who's talking about getting Ozempic and these kinds of drugs in everybody's hands. Yeah. So at any rate, it's an astonishing turnaround. It's like for a public health finding, it's the same equivalent as the rapid adoption of gay marriage, which is now being threatened, of course. But
yeah. So the only similar correlation I can think of from recent years is between the rise of social media and mental health crisis among girls. So maybe we can reach a deal of banning Instagram for Ozempic. But at any rate, I'm assuming that this means that this will become a live political issue.
I certainly hope so. I'd much rather argue about this than whether Trump's building Death Star next to the White House.
All right, sir. A pleasure as always. I'm slightly anxious that we agreed more than we should, but I'll get over it.
I have to see what quality of robot I can get you for Christmas.
There you go. All right.
Check with your wife. Make sure it's okay.
Okay. See you soon.
Okay. Bye.